Hello, my name is Ambient, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of a shorter theory that I hope if I can explain it well enough, that it can start to open a few minds about just the huge implications that are going on in the One Piece story from the very start of Chapter 1. And so with that, like all great One Piece theories, I'm going to start by asking you a question. What do you think is happening here? This is the moment where Luffy stabs himself in the face in hopes of proving to Shanks that he's tough enough to join Shanks' pirate crew and take part in the adventures. But let's really take a look at this moment because it really sets up everything going forward in the One Piece story from this moment on. So in this moment of overzealousness, Luffy is stabbing himself in the face. He's trying to prove a point to Shanks, using the point of a sword tip for some reason to stab himself in the cheek. And now, right off the bat, I have some pretty pressing questions. Like all fairy tales, they're really messages and stories to parents about how to take care of your children properly. And the first question I want to ask is, how the hell did Luffy get up there on top of the mast of the ship? Either one, no one was watching while this little 8-year-old kid is running around the top of a pirate ship, or two, he's up there as entertainment because they all seem to be watching him while he's doing this and waiting for Luffy to do something of entertaining value. So either he got up there because of no parental supervision, or he was put up there as entertainment. Starting off strong. And if you think that Luffy, he just snuck up there or whatever. Oda has stated that Ben Beckman is the smartest man in the One Piece world this side of Vegapunk. And also, we know there's lots of crazy stuff going on with the Gum Gum fruit later on in this chapter and how mysteriously it ended up in front of Luffy to be eaten in frustration. Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates are a Yonko crew, and even now they're doing plans and all sorts of stuff, I think, to, ultimately conquer and rule the world. But the idea that anyone could just sneak on board their pirate ship and do whatever they want, how dumb do we really believe the Red Hair Pirates are? I mean, I know Luffy's got special powers and he can go unnoticed and all this stuff, but I do not believe that the Red Hair Pirates and all of the things we've heard about them and how much they've been built up in the story, that they're just a bunch of fucking idiots and they just, Luffy just does, whatever he wants around them. Now, yes, in Chapter 1, Luffy does walk around and eats the Gum Gum fruit supposedly unnoticed and everything, but I do not think that anything that happens in Chapter 1 is due to the Red Hair Pirates neglecting anything. I believe that everything Luffy does is all part of their ultimate plan. But either way, my next question is, where did this small child get this dangerous knife in the first place? Okay, another parenting question. Now, we'll get to how this knife right here that Luffy uses to stab himself in the face is actually the same exact fruit cutting knife that Mihawk has in his cross. But then I'll be at the end of the video. To start with, I think there's a lot to the idea that the opening scene of the One Piece manga, where it's Roger's execution, is very much similar and symbolically equal to Jesus' crucifixion. And I do think that there's a huge chance that the tip of, like the spear of Longinus, the spear that actually kills Jesus Christ while he's on the cross, I believe that the tip of that spear could be what's put into this blade hilt that Luffy is holding here.
Dear God, the Lance of Longinus returned.
You're quoting that twig boy at me?
And before I lose you, I don't think that it's a new take to have noticed the similarities between Luffy and Jesus and his disciples and all sorts of things on the hero's journey and all sorts of things like that. Well, one of the aspects of Jesus, and especially his death and all that, was that he prophesied his betrayer. And he also said, and I'll just read the exact quote here, "I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me." And he's all referring to Jesus knowing that he will be betrayed by Judas. And what's most important here is that it's part of a prophecy. It's something that's already been dictated. It's in the scripture. It's written away. It's as it is written, as Jesus says. Now, that bread line is interesting because the last thing that Luffy actually eats before he eats the Gum Gum fruit in Chapter 1 is a loaf of bread. And even crazier than that, I think another clue to all this Judas stuff is a quote from the Bible. "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me." And I believe that's a whole reference to both of them kind of getting soaked when Higuma shows up and breaks the bottle on the bar, and they get soaked in grog. Now, this entire event of Jesus being betrayed after the Last Supper by Judas Iscariot is known in Christianity as the Kiss of Judas and as the betrayal of Christ. And in Christianity, the betrayal is actually observed on what's known as Spy Wednesday or Holy Wednesday of the Holy Week. So I do believe that's all a clue to Vivi when she was part of Baroque Works and she was a spy the entire time, and her code name was, of course, Miss Wednesday. Now, ultimately, all of this betrayal of Jesus by Judas is signified by a kiss from Judas to Jesus Christ. And the kiss marks Jesus as the person that, the clubs and spears and the Romans or whatever are hunting down. And whoever Judas kisses is who they're looking for, is the mark of betrayal, essentially. And now, broadly speaking, according to Wikipedia, a Judas kiss may refer to an act of appearing to be an act of friendship, which is in fact harmful to the recipient, which is, I think, all around the entire story, but especially here with Shanks, but I'm not going to get into that here. And with this entire idea of the betrayal of Christ, one of the vital components of this whole event is that Jesus essentially foresaw the betrayal and still chose for it to happen, because obviously everything he was put here to do on earth, all that stuff with burdening and bearing the sins of mankind and all that stuff, that's why, technically he was put on earth. He knows he needs to be betrayed to eventually be crucified to save mankind. And in my opinion, I believe that Oda is playing with that aspect of this entire thing by having Luffy choose in this moment to stab himself in the face. He's just like how Jesus allowed Judas to kiss him and signify that he was the one the Romans were looking for. I believe this is in some way Luffy choosing to be susceptible to blades in some fashion, or at least this particular blade or spear tip. And now, before I sound too crazy, all of the depictions of in high class art and all this stuff, and in Renaissance art and medieval art and every piece of art, it all looks like Jesus is getting kissed on the cheek by Judas in the exact spot that Luffy stabs himself in the cheek. And when Jesus actually gets kissed by Judas, he says, "Friend, do what you are here to do," according to Matthew. And that's kind of one of the crazier, confusing clues I think Oda has going on in Chapter 1, because one of the most touching moments in Chapter 1 is when Luffy's saved by Shanks and his crew, and Shanks calls him his friend, and Luffy has that big moment. But as I said earlier about all fairy tales kind of being messages to parents about how to properly teach and rear their children or whatever, the idea that your child is your friend is great and all, but your child needs you to be a parent. So ultimately, I do think it's kind of a hidden, weird clue Oda's doing to all that stuff, tying into the whole unsupervised beginning and putting a child in danger by not looking after them. That is essentially all of Luffy's life. And this whole kiss of betrayal thing has been referenced in all sorts of media. I mean, probably most famously from Michael Corleone to Alfredo in Godfather Part 2 when he kisses him after he realizes that he's betrayed him.
I know it was you, Fredo. You broke my heart. You broke my heart.
But even all this, I don't ultimately think is the end of what's going on here. After Luffy eats the gum fruit, he's pretty much invincible, okay? But it makes sense to the modern reader, and even myself as a child reading this for the first time at like 13 years old, the idea that the superpower of being rubber would be susceptible to sharp things and blades and knives and stuff like that. Well, what if I was to tell you that the only reason that Luffy is so vulnerable to that for so long in the story is because he thinks that's the reality that he lives in. In this moment, it sets up in Luffy's mind that knives can stab him. Staying along those same lines as Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was the physical reborn body of God in some form, and there's lots of stories of Jesus. There's lots of old, different versions and different gods in areas that aren't called Jesus, and all these things of basically a God rebirthing itself. And one of the biggest things, especially when it came to Viking ships, that on the front bow of the ship, they would have a figurehead, which for the Vikings in particularly was used as a type of protective magic. And in olden times of Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, it was believed that actually Klabautermann lived in these figureheads of the ships, and that they were all meant to ward off danger and evil spirits from the ship and then protect the sailors inside the ship. And if the ship was to crash, it was even believed that these spirits would guide the dead sailors to the land of the dead safely. And I do believe that Luffy is some type of fairy, probably much more akin to a type of djinn or genie, but essentially some sort of a magical being or godly vessel is what I think that Luffy is at the start. I'm not going to get into it in this video, but I believe that all kind of ties into this, with his favorite seat being the bow of the ship and the figurehead and all that stuff. But regardless of all that stuff, the figurehead was meant to represent the owner of the ship's wealth and power. And in relation to that, there's tons of ancient myths where the gods eventually get a ship to transverse the universe, and it kind of becomes, the chariot that pulls the sun or brings the night sky, stuff like that. When it came to those godly ships, lots of times the figurehead that was used for those ships was the head of whatever the strongest monster, the hero or god in that vehicle had slain, kind of as a sign of, hey, look how bad and strong we are. We took out, the Hydra, we took out Medusa, stuff like that. You would put that on the front of the ship as a figurehead to show just how strong this ship was and how it wasn't to be messed with. And I believe that when we first start off chapter 1, this dragon thing in the front here and everything with Luffy, he is the starting of the rebirth process of this One Piece world's creator god. And in this moment, he is being reborn. He's invincible. It has to be implanted, the idea. Just like how it's implanted that the gum fruit does what it does when Shanks has this Jafar hypnotizing the Sultan moment where he, grabs him. And I think it's very important to note that the very first things that actually stretch on Luffy are things that Shanks and his golden Midas touch are actually touching in the moment. And I do believe that that's a huge factor for how everything, funnels out from chapter 1 is just what Shanks is interacting with. And part of why I say that is because, to me, after reading this so many times, Luffy's powers are activated and the whole idea of devil fruits are introduced the moment that Luffy loses faith in Shanks. Literally in chapter 1, the moment that Luffy turns away from Shanks and may be ready to abandon him and pirates forever, Shanks grabs him and, bounces him right back to being on the right path as far as Shanks and the red-haired pirates are concerned. And part of that is kind of making sure that this maybe at the start invincible, immortal, god Luffy thinks he's susceptible to something that Shanks has, which is, ultimately his sword, Griffon. Which, as I've been saying in all my videos, is a reference to the Universal Monsters Invisible Man. That's the name of the Invisible Man. It's also a reference to the Andy Griffith Show and being the sheriff of Mulberry and kind of maybe being a pseudo-sheriff of the Grand Line, so to speak, for Shanks and his crew. And then I know a lot of people don't believe me yet, but it's also a major reference to Griffith, the leader of the Band of the Hawk from the Berserk series. I think kind of all hinting at the invisible hand that pulls all the strings, the puppet master of the One Piece universe. I think it would be fair to call him kind of the invisible hand of justice. I'm just not sure that it's the type of justice that the average reader is prepared for when it comes to Shanks and his beliefs. And I know that sounds crazy, so I'll just point your attention to something else that you probably not noticed. I know I myself did not notice it after reading it for almost 20 years.
So,
Hans, are we the baddies?
Before actually eating the gum fruit in chapter 1, every single thing that Luffy does with his hands, he's actually doing with both of his hands. The only actual moment that he holds something with just his left hand is that knife. And when it comes to like old literary tropes and fairy tale myths and stuff, left-handedness was always kind of viewed as like a sign of evil. And it's a very outdated, barbaric trope, but I do believe that this separated moment where the left hand is alone, holding the knife up in the air, and then when he actually stabs himself, it looks like he's holding with both hands, kind of, holding the bottom of the hilt and pushing it up. But when he holds the glass in chapter 1, all this stuff, he's always using two hands, even the fork and knife, and when he's trying to bite into the thing, he's holding the fork, all that stuff. After he eats the devil fruit, he ends every single thing he does is with only one hand, until actually the bazooka he does against Buggy in Volume 3. But I do ultimately think that left hand thing is kind of a clue to all that stuff. And now, ultimately, I think that this is referring to kind of like the eternal flame of mankind, and the same thing that's referenced from the Olympics and the Colossus of Rhodes. And I think, funnily enough, the Statue of Liberty, which seems kind of obvious once we see it, but just kind of being a personification of this eternal flame. And I think kind of reaching or being returned back to its original source, I think is what Oda's ultimately referencing here with the Olympic flames and the Prometheus type stuff. And I think there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Zoroastrian religion and the eternal flames that they worship. And I'm not an expert by any means in the religion at all, but one of the main sources of fire that they worship is called the Atashi Varam, which actually means the victorious fire, which really kind of brings me to thinking of Nika and the hair and all that stuff that Luffy has in his new Gear 5 form. And of course, kind of, Nike, Nika being the Greek god of victory, I think ties back into this Olympic flame idea. Now, I don't want to harp on this too much because Luffy is not that. I'm gonna just throw it out there right now. Like, Luffy is a type of wishing well or a wishing star, and the metal that he's holding there, that sword aspect of him, is this using fire and light to create something in our world. And all of that stuff ties into Zoro, like this, obviously the name Zoroastrianism. And mainly, I think, relating to his special swords. And that perfectly leads us into something I want to talk about, which is present throughout the entire One Piece manga story.
We have to go back!
Those little name tag plates that show up for when every single character is introduced, except for Zoro. Every other character, they get this little name badge thing. And I think that when it comes to the One Piece characters, whenever we see their kind of nameplate thing come up with these spirals, whatever they're touching is always, always super important. And for Luffy, a whole bunch of stuff, but a chunk of wood and the white outline of the manga panel and the sound effect, I think those are all extremely relevant. And the wood chunk thing being susceptible to, being chopped up by a knife or a sword, even in this shot, it kind of looks like it's just, a lone log kind of thing there. And, I know that sounds crazy, but, it doesn't take much, to get to this log word. It's the very first thing said about, in the author's note of Volume 1. It's also, if you take gold and turn it around, it's the D-log. So I think there's lots of stuff to all of those things going on here. But how this tip of the spear, the Lance of Longinus and all that stuff ties into betrayal, and specifically Zoro and Mihawk, we'll have to watch the next video. I apologize. And just to put that finishing touch on this theory, or start of this theory, kind of unraveling the secrets of the One Piece story, starting from chapter 1, I ultimately think that this whole entire process here is actually referencing Oda daydreaming with his mind and eyes in the clouds, and the sword is the pen tip with ink on it, and he draws the page. I believe that's the kind of the alchemical process that Oda's playing with when it comes to formulating the actual pages of the One Piece manga and the story world. Ultimately, I think kind of being a whole ring around the rosy thing of playing around with the idea of a creation god and a scribe of the gods and a messenger of the gods and a deliverer of the gods and all sorts of stuff relating to things like that. But we'll touch on that, of course, in future videos. And with that tease, my name is Adam Jinrakai. If you liked the video, please like and comment with if you think any of this craziness has any validity at all to it. And please comment down below what you might think of these ideas I brought forward in this video. And please subscribe if you're interested in weekly content from me covering One Piece, Berserk, and coming up, a Song of Ice and Fire content with my wife, and hopefully future series and stuff like that. Just these videos are killer to make, so I can only do so much right now. It's not my full-time job or anything like that. But thank you so much for watching the video. I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.